Going to continue our discussion for political geography now, really jumping into the concept of exactly what a state is, as that's the core of this unit and our core of our unit of study. So let's start off first with just a basic definition of political geography. So political geography is the field of geography that deals with boundaries, divisions, and possessions of countries. So we're going to see essentially how countries are created, how they are divided, and what causes the divisions and the consequences thereof, and what it really means to possess this territory, kind of a concept that's called territoriality, which we'll revisit in a few flipped videos. This concept of a state, and from this moment forward, we're going to use the terminology state instead of country. A state is the fundamental unit of political geography. In other words, in our math system, we are a base 10 math system. That's the number from which everything else is essentially created in our mathematics. The state is the basis of everything that's related to political geography. And we're going to talk about this in the next flip video, that wasn't always the case. The concept of a state wasn't necessarily the same as our modern conception. But for now, what we're going to understand and we're going to focus on is that we're going to see the world through the lenses of a state and how they're created, they're maintained, and the forces within them. So essentially, for political geography, if you look at these two maps, kind of helps us. We need to never forget that the map that we're accustomed to seeing, which is the political map at the bottom right, is really not the map of the world. The map of the world and the territory of the world is what we see from space. We are now going to then study how we transition and how it is that we've gone from the map at the top to the map at the bottom, being our basic conception of the world and the organization of the world. So let's get some definitions. A state. A state is an area organized into a political unit, so obviously government, and ruled by an established government that has control over its internal and foreign affairs. That concept of control over its own internal and external affairs is called sovereignty, which we'll get to in just a minute. And as I just mentioned, this concept of a state is the basis of our study. An example, the United States, despite both our toponym and our daily lingo of states, the United States is a state. We are a country. We have control over our internal affairs. Puerto Rico, for example, is not a state. Puerto Rico is a colony of the United States. They do not have complete control over their internal and external affairs. And the differences between these two is really what we're going to unpackage in the coming weeks. The characteristics of what actually makes a state, these are not universally agreed upon. There's many different definitions, but we're going to work off of these basic characteristics. To be a state, you have to have a permanent population. You can't have people come in and go, and there has to be a resident, permanent population of people. Got to have boundaries, got to be defined where your territory is and where it's not. Need a government, so you need some sort of ruling structure. Need an economy, so some way to create and to support people in this place. And here's where sovereignty comes in. Must have sovereignty. When the United States was the 13 colonies, we did not have sovereignty. Therefore, we were not a country. We were not a state. But now, with independence, we have complete autonomy, complete sovereignty. And this last piece of being that to be a state, you must be recognized by other states. And that can get real controversial. In fact, both of those final two can become very controversial. It's pretty easy to establish the first four. It's pretty difficult to establish sovereignty and to get other states to actually recognize your state as a state. For example, Taiwan. Now, the Chinese would not even agree with me identifying that island at the top right as Taiwan. That would be referred to as an island they say is the Chinese Taipei. Well, the people of Taiwan would argue that in fact would actually be Taiwan, that Taiwan is an independent area. So the conflicted relationship between the two there is an example of how the definition of a state is not necessarily as concrete as we may think. Another example would be Palestine or Israel. According to the Israelis, these areas identified here would be considered Israel. There are many Palestinians would argue that area is actually considered to be Palestine, and the entire region which is considered to be Palestine. So again, this concept of what a country is and what it's not is not always necessarily as cut and dry. Now, this is important. Just like we had to throw out our lingo and we had to kind of regroup on our idea of what a state is, we need to also regroup on what the idea of a nation is, because these terms are used very fluidly and interchangeably in just common language, but we're going to use some geographic terms here. And in geography, The term nation is different than the reference to a country. Instead, a nation is a group of people who have a common culture, identity, and history. In other words, this is really closely connected to the concept of ethnicity, that the ethnic groups are essentially cultural groups who have that common bond. They typically share some the common cultural history, common ethnicity can, as I mentioned in Flip Video 4.1, can be related to biology. But so if an ethnic group is a culture group, think of a nation as that same a culture group who typically wants to have their own territory. Now you don't have to, that's funny. You don't have to want to have territory necessarily to be considered a nation, but think of this idea of a nation as being culture groups. Not a country, but culture groups. So we have states that are countries, nations are culture groups. And very often those culture groups want territory. That's what we're going to explore and how that affects the state. Now, give you an example of the difference between an ethnicity, or give you an example of a nation. A nation would be groups of people. So, well, actually, let me stop there. Nation, culture groups who often want territory. State is the country. Let's leave it at that. Now, things are about to get complicated when these two concepts blend together. So, for example, there is the concept of a nation state. Now, a nation state is a pretty theoretical concept because there's no perfect example of a country who has only one ethnicity. That makes sense because that would be a nation, a state whose population possesses a substantial degree of cultural unity and homogeneity. In other words, a state, a country, who has one nation, an ethnicity. So a nation state is a place where the nation's border, the borders of the nation, where that ethnic group is found, is exactly the same as the borders of a country. The example that we can think of that's the closest example would be Japan. Look at this group here, this graph here about the culture groups of Japan, the languages of Japan, and the religions of Japan. We see here, and we talked about this with a monolingual state of Japan. Japan's essentially a monolingual state. Japanese, 99% of the people speak Japanese. That's pretty much as monolingual as it gets. We see that there's very similar cultures, very similar religion. Remember, those are not necessarily all one and the same. We could argue, we look at the borders of Japan in the bottom right there, that because the borders of because the borders of the Japanese nation, meaning the group of people who have this culture group here, have the same borders as the country of Japan, that's in essence a nation state. A country where there is essentially one nation, one ethnic group. Now that's of course not perfect, which is why I'm saying there's no perfect example. Other similar example would be Iceland, right? Iceland's pretty isolated, and it has an isolated language. The Icelandic language has changed very little over about 1,000 years. Consequently, the ethnic composition, the cultural composition of Iceland is pretty homogeneous. The borders of Iceland, the state, essentially match the borders of where the ethnic group, the nation, is found. Therefore, both Japan and Iceland serve as excellent examples of nation states. Another example of nation states would be found in southeastern Europe. This territory right here is what used to be known as Yugoslavia. Now, Yugoslavia underwent a particularly tragic ethnic cleansing and conflict in the 90s. And as a result, this area that's shown in green is now what's called fragmented, split apart into separate countries that are all based upon nationality, based upon ethnicity. So what was once an area that was quite diverse of Yugoslavia fell apart into these different countries that are all now individual nation states. The Serbs live in Serbia, the Bosnians live in Bosnia and Herzegovina, the Croats live in Croatia, and so on and so forth. What happened to Yugoslavia here, where a country is falling apart and fragmented into smaller regions that are all based upon nationality, is called Balkanization. So that's a term we'll come back to. But I want to introduce this idea that Yugoslavia fell apart into what is now known as nation states, because we've got one country and one nationality in one place. There's also, nation state is this theoretical example. What's much more common is what are known as multi-nation states and multi-state nations. Okay, picking up where we left off, sorry about that. We also have different political organizations, so different ways in which a state is organized, and it's affected by the groups of people who live in the state. So another example would be what's called a multi-nation state. So let's maintain those same definitions we've been working with. Multi, of course, multiple. Nations, different culture groups, and states. So we've got a state that has multiple nations within it. So the simplistic definition, country with two or more nationalities within its borders. Easy example, United States, right? Plenty of different ethnic groups and culture groups that live within the United States and peacefully coexist within one state. Another excellent example would be the Russian Federation. That's technically the full name for Russia, the Russian Federation. Well, not full, but what the Russian Federation is known as. So you can see this is a map of Russia spanning, of course, Europe and Asia. And you can see by the different colors here on this choropleth map that there are many, many different ethnic groups, many different nations that comprise, that exist within the country, the state of Russia. So a multi-nation state has multiple different nations within that one state. Now you can see that we're laying the groundwork for conflict here, because you can imagine, I mentioned before, peaceful coexistence, but that's not necessarily always true. Different groups of people believe that their lives are different than others. And here comes the announcements, I'm sorry. Oh, maybe not. You can see that in a multi-nation state, they can face problems of unity if you've got different groups of people who do not all feel that centripetal force, who do not all feel that they are part, that sense of nationalism, that they're all part of the same state. So a multi-nation state often faces problems with unity, but not necessarily have to. So
Mr. Sims, you need it in the main office.
let that go. Okay, there it is. Now we got there's also what's known. Here's another example. I'm sorry, of a multi-nation state, and this actually really supports our study of language, because we mentioned already that China has tremendous linguistic diversity. China is an excellent example of a multi-nation state. Different nationalities, different groups, different culture groups, all living within one country. And those culture groups, those nationalities, can look quite different in terms of their practices, their beliefs. And in this example, as you see with my language map, that's reflected, as I said, in the linguistic diversity of China. Now, to make it even more confusing, let's flip those two terms. There's also what's called a multi-state nation. So this is a nation, a culture group, that transcends, that means goes beyond the borders of two or more states. In other words, it's a nation, that culture group of people, that exist in multiple different states, different countries. The commonly cited example here is Korea. So a little history background, as some of you have already studied. Korea, the Korean peninsula, was once united as a single country. But the Korean War left the Korean peninsula divided into two countries, North Korea and South Korea. Well, these ethnic groups, the Koreans, that were once united on one state, so a nation state, right? One state, one nation, are now divided. That means that the nation, the Korean ethnic group, is now divided between two states, North Korea and South Korea. So it's one ethnic group that is present in two separate states, two separate countries. Now, I have to just drop this little, plant a seed here, because we're going to return to it later. What's so interesting is that we've got one ethnic groups, generally similar practices, beliefs, upbringing, so on and so forth. Well, not upbringing, but generally saying beliefs, culture, religious practices. But yet, look at the picture of North Korea versus South Korea at night. Unbelievable difference in the development, and clearly North Korea is significantly underdeveloped as compared to South Korea, which is so interesting when you consider these as a similar ethnic group. And we'll break down the reasons why that such a difference exists in the coming weeks. Another example of a multi-state nation would be the Yoruba people. As you see in the bottom right, where the Yoruba ethnic group is located is shown here in yellow. Yet that ethnic group transcends; it goes beyond the borders of one particular country. So we've got Yoruba who live within Nigeria, and many Yoruba people who live within Benin. That would be an example of a multi-state nation. Now, finally, to really layer it on here in the confusion here, we also have what's called a stateless nation. So that's going to be a nation, culture group, without a state, without a homeland, without an area to call their own. I'm sorry, this Korea map should go away. So let's take that out. The key example, I'm going to give you several, but the one that's most commonly cited is the stateless nation known as the Kurds. So stateless nation, of course, is referring to an ethnic group, the ethnic group that does not have a state. The Kurds are a group of people who are distributed across Armenia, Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. So because you'll see here, if you look at that map in the top right, the Kurds, the area where this ethnic group lives, this culture group exists, is not just within one country. Rather, they don't have any country. There's no country that corresponds to the distribution of the Kurdish people. Consequently, this Kurdish people seek the creation of what they call Kurdistan. And you can see a theoretical, it doesn't exist, theoretical version of what Kurdistan would look like. This makes sense. There's a concept called self-determination, the idea that nations of people have the right to rule themselves. Stateless nations often believe, as many nations do, that they have the right to rule themselves, that they are a common ethnic group, common practices, common beliefs, common ways of living, that they should have a place to call their own. So being a stateless nation often causes conflict because people seek to create their own identity, their own place, right, where they exist and that where their nation has its own territory. Other examples of stateless nations, some review a little bit here back to language. One would be the example of the Basques. The Basques are in the northern region of Spain. You can see in the map up top left. They're located within France and Spain, excuse me. They're located in the Pyrenees Mountains. They have an isolated language and, in many senses, isolated culture that's very different from the culture that exists in Spain and France, or language more specifically of France and Spain. And as a result, they seek their own territory. They seek to have a place that would be their state. Similarly, and this actually has picked up momentum very recently in November, Catalonia, which is another area of Spain, you can see on the Mediterranean coast of Spain. Catalonia was pushing forward for a move for full and complete independence from Spain. And you can see there's a very strong Catalonian independence movement under the idea, again, a stateless nation. This is a group of people who believe that their nation does not have a state of its own. So they are currently seeking that within Spain. Another stateless nation is the Rohingya people. These are Muslims who are facing persecution in Myanmar, which is also formerly known as Burma. And you can see, we talked about this when we talked about migration patterns and refugees. There is a massive, massive emigration of these people, specifically because of their faith, into other areas of Southeast Asia. So another example of a stateless nation. Lastly, one that's pretty famous, commonly known, but maybe not as a term of a stateless nation, is Tibet and the Tibetan people. Tibet, you can see in the map, is located there in southwest. It's a region located in southwest China. China maintains that Tibet is an area that's in rebellion, whereas Tibet states that it's an independent place. Therefore, if they're claiming that they're independent but are being forced to stay within China, then that falls under the category of a stateless nation because they're arguing that that their culture group, their nation, does not have its own state, simply because they're quote unquote forced, or really the phrasing there could be kind of tricky because China wouldn't agree with that. But China claims it's part of their country, and therefore, if that's the case, then Tibet doesn't have a land of its own, making it a stateless nation. That, of course, is open to interpretation because that's, as we just said, would not be how China would see that. Okay, that's the background here of what a state is and how that is different than what a nation is, and how a state can take on many different forms. And lastly, for your question number 4, please make sure you give me more than just yes or no, but of course telling me why. All right, thanks, guys.